In today's gospel reading from the Gospel of Luke, we get this short but I think really important and interesting story about what happens to Jesus and his disciples as they're on the way to Jerusalem. So, to set this up, Jesus has decided that whatever he needs to do to serve his Father's will, he needs to go to Jerusalem to do it, even in the face of the opposition that he might encounter. The Transfiguration has just happened in this gospel, and he's starting to prep his disciples of this kingdom that's coming, this rule or reign that's starting. It's going to look different than you might have expected. It's not going to look like a conquering army. It's going to look like a guy on a donkey. Who seemingly gets killed by the powers that oppose God's plan. And so he's on the way to Jerusalem, and they pass by a Samaritan village. And he sends his disciples ahead, as he seems to usually do, find a place to stay for the night, find something to eat in this Samaritan village. And the Samaritans refuse to welcome them because they're on their way to Jerusalem. So to understand that means we need to know a little bit about who these Samaritans are. We might be familiar with them from the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. We find that just in the next chapter of Luke, not coincidentally, I think. But who are these people from Samaria? I was really lucky. I was able to get a free ticket from the Washington Theological Consortium to go to a new exhibit at the Museum of the Bible that just opened on the Samaritans. Now, I was also happy to not give more money to the Hobby Lobby people, but you can make your own choices. It's a worthwhile exhibit. I think you'd learn a lot. And because there still are Samaritans. The Samaritans were a people that shared with the Jewish people a devotion to the God revealed by Moses, a form of the first 5 books of Torah that slightly different in some cases, but they thought of as, and think of today as the more original or more accurate version or understanding of Torah. And scholars and historians have been divided as where did these people come from? Are these the people who were left behind after the Babylonian exile? Are these the remnants of the people that otherwise were conquered in the northern kingdom of Israel? A whole bunch of theories that you can find. But the main point for us is that one of the big markers of identity between them was that Judeans, Jews, and also people from Galilee like Jesus thought that Jerusalem was the primary place where you could go and offer sacrifice to God. And the Samaritans thought that their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim, in what's today Israel, Palestine, was the place where the temple always would be and always should be. So they are not going to welcome somebody who's going to those other people's temple. And the most important part of this story, I think, that gets really interesting is what the reaction is from James and John. So James and John, when they saw this, ask, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them?" And it says, Jesus turned to rebuke them, and they journeyed to another village. So calling down fire from heaven to consume them. John and James are a lot of fun. In the Gospel of Mark, they get a nickname, the Sons of Thunder, from Jesus. And like many nicknames, it's both sort of a term of affection with a little bit of a dig, a little bit of a critique, right? That these are the guys, the thunderbolts. They're always ready to go off and maybe express their feelings or perhaps their anger without necessarily thinking ahead of time. They just come in like a bolt of lightning. If you remember in the Gospel of Mark, it's John and James who come up to Jesus and say, "Hey, when you come into your kingdom, we want to be on your left and on your right." They're these kind of guys who sometimes act and speak before they think carefully about it. And their first reaction here is, well, these people won't let us stay in their town. We should get them. God should smite them. God should send down lightning from heaven and we can help. Right, boss? And Jesus turns to them, and you, as a teacher myself, I can't imagine he didn't feel a little bit of frustration that they haven't quite gotten the lesson yet. He turns to them and says, "No, this is not what we're about. We're not about that kind of kingdom. We're not about that kind of vengeance. We're just going to go to the next village. How's that sound, guys?" And it's not coincidental, I think, that he then teaches them a parable just a short time later that involves a good Samaritan, this example of somebody living out the values of the reign of God, who's not a Judean, who's not Jewish. What do we do with that for us? So there's an easy lesson and a hard lesson here, right? The easiest lesson, I think, is that this is a lesson, it's an important lesson about vengeance, that vengeance belongs to God and not us. that we should love our enemies as ourselves and pray for those who persecute us, about fighting evil not with the tools of evil, but fighting them instead with pacifist or nonviolent resistance and ways of not returning evil for evil done to us. And that's an important, crucial lesson. But there's a deeper and I think a harder lesson here about what does identity look like for this reign of God. How do we hold on to our identities and look at the boundary lines between our identities with a little more, a little lighter touch, a little more room for doubt, a little more room for humility? The line between Samaritans and Jews was as stark and as bright as any other line, perhaps even brighter than the line between Jews and Gentiles, because at least the Gentiles, it's not their fault. These Samaritans, they should know better. That it's kind of like fights within your own family. And yet here you see Jesus' response is trying to lead the thunderbolts into seeing that this difference of opinion, this difference of identity, means that, well, we're going to let these people be who they are, and hopefully they will let us be who we are. And judgment is not at the end of the day ours. It's not ours to decide whether lightning should come from the sky and smite them. That's God's job. It's not ours to sort of figure out, especially in a world or a church or a family where we are so divided over who we are, divided over what we think. Jesus provides a model here of kind of letting be, along with continuing to do his mission, continuing to follow his Father's will, but letting be those who seem opposed to him. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of what God does. We read elsewhere in Scripture that God lets the rain fall on those who are righteous and on those who are wicked in the same way. That God leads the wheat and the weeds to grow together until it's time to evaluate them. And we need to, especially those of us who are convinced that our political party is correct, or are convinced that our way of being Catholic is correct, or are convinced that our way of raising our children or living in our families is correct. We need that humility of recognizing that their way of doing things, their way of thinking, how do we know at the end of the day that we're not the wicked whose God's mercy is allowing to continue and whose grace we will need to be forgiven? How do we know that we're not the weeds? How do we make space for that possibility, and in making that space, provide room to think before anything else, before we belong to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, before we're traditional or progressive in our Catholicism, before anything else, we are the children of God. And God, thank God, causes the rain to fall down on us and on our enemies or on those who disagree with us, and not lightning and thunder.